The sun was just starting to dip behind the tall buildings surrounding the college campus, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Most students had already finished their classes and were heading home, chatting with friends, scrolling on their phones, or riding their bikes across the campus paths. But one student was walking alone, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her own world. She had a calm, almost serene expression, as if nothing could touch her. But beneath that calm, there was a strength that few people would notice at first glance. A strength forged through discipline, training, and life experiences that most students could never imagine. As she walked down the side street that led past the parking lot, a low rumble of motorcycles echoed from around the corner. A group of bikers, leather jackets creaking as they leaned against their bikes, noticed her instantly. They were a loud, brash group, used to drawing attention and testing the limits of everyone around them. When they saw someone walking alone, carrying nothing more dangerous than a backpack and headphones, they saw a target. To them, it was just another opportunity to show off, to feel dominant, to have a little fun at someone else's expense. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" "All alone," one of them called out, his voice rough and teasing. She didn't immediately respond. Her pace didn't falter, and she kept her eyes forward, as though she hadn't even heard him. But inside, she was already analyzing the situation. She noticed the slight twitch in one biker's shoulder, the way another kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Small details, but to her, they were like pieces of a puzzle. She understood the threat without making it obvious. Her heart rate stayed steady, her breathing calm. This wasn't fear, it was focus. The bikers laughed among themselves, thinking her silence was a sign of fear. They circled a little closer, their motorcycles parked haphazardly across the side street so no one could pass without brushing past them. One of the bikers leaned on his bike and called out again, louder this time, trying to provoke a reaction. "Hey, are you deaf too, or are you just scared?" That was the trigger they had been waiting for. Some people might have panicked. Some might have raised their voice, argued, or tried to walk away quickly. But she didn't. She simply adjusted the strap of her backpack, took a small step to the side, and looked at them. It wasn't a glare, and it wasn't an angry stare. It was a steady, calm look full of awareness and confidence. It was the kind of look that silently said, "I know exactly what you're doing, and it won't work." The bikers didn't understand the subtle message. They just thought she was hesitating, still trying to gather her courage. One of them, the loudest of the group, smirked and swaggered closer, raising his voice to intimidate her. "Come on, little girl. Why don't you give us a smile? You look way too serious for someone walking alone at night." She tilted her head slightly, almost curious rather than scared. The corners of her mouth lifted into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it wasn't the smile they expected. It wasn't a nervous, apologetic smile. It was a calm, knowing smile, the kind someone gives when they know exactly what's about to happen and are completely prepared for it. At that moment, a few students walking past from the opposite direction glanced over, sensing the tension. The street was quiet except for the rumble of the motorcycles and the soft hum of distant traffic. No one intervened. Some pulled their jackets tighter, pretending not to watch, but they were curious, drawn by the silent standoff between the two, lone student and the group of bikers. The bikers laughed again, louder this time, thinking they had finally rattled her. One of them, trying to act tough, took a small step closer and intentionally brushed against her shoulder with his arm. It was a small, careless shove, but in that moment her training kicked in. Her body moved instinctively, balanced and precise. She didn't react with panic or anger. She simply shifted her weight slightly, keeping herself steady and unflustered, her eyes never leaving his. It was the smallest movement, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a subtle message. She was not weak, and she was not someone to mess with. The biker didn't see it at first. He was too busy laughing and thinking he had control. But slowly, almost without realizing it, the rest of the group began to sense that something was different about her. There was a calmness in her presence that didn't belong to someone scared. There was an alertness in her stance that hinted she was ready for anything. Something about her made them hesitate just a little. "Hey, why are you staring at me? Like that?" the loudest biker finally asked, trying to cover his uncertainty with more bluster. She tilted her head slightly and took a measured breath. "I'm just watching," she said softly. Her voice was even, calm, but it carried weight, an unspoken warning that she wasn't just going to let them push her around. The bikers exchanged quick, nervous glances. It was subtle, but the dynamic was shifting. They had expected a nervous, apologetic young student, someone who might cower or try to run. Instead, they found someone completely composed, someone who seemed ready for anything, and that made them unsure. Still, they didn't back down. One of them stepped in front of her, blocking the path with a casual stance, his hands on his hips. "You think you're tough or something?" he asked, trying to goad her. She didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She simply stepped slightly to the side, keeping her balance, her eyes calm and steady. There was no aggression, only control. She didn't need to act. Her presence alone said enough. At that moment, one of the bikers thought it would be funny to grab her backpack. It was a reckless move, and to anyone else it might have seemed like a harmless prank. But she was ready. In a blink, her hand shot out, firmly but not violently, pulling her backpack back. The action was precise, almost surgical, and the biker froze, shocked at her speed and confidence. The street was silent for a moment, except for the soft engine hums of the parked motorcycles. For the first time, the bikers began to doubt themselves. They had thought this would be an easy, entertaining interaction, but now, something about her made them pause. They couldn't read her the way they could read other people. They had miscalculated. She continued walking slowly, keeping her eyes on them without speeding up. Her steps were steady, deliberate. It was a subtle message. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't running, and she wasn't going to let them control the situation. As she passed them, one of the bikers muttered something under his breath, frustration creeping into his voice. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected anyone to remain so calm, so controlled in the face of their bullying. The student walked on, each step measured, her mind still sharp and aware. She knew the bikers would not easily give up their bravado, but she also knew that she didn't need to engage in a fight to assert herself. Her presence alone, backed by years of discipline and experience, was enough to disrupt their assumptions and make them think twice. By the time she reached the corner and turned toward the main road, the bikers were still standing there, confused and unsure. They had underestimated her, and now they were left with that uneasy feeling that comes when someone refuses to be intimidated. She had walked alone, calmly, steadily, without raising her voice or showing anger, but she had already won the first round. She disappeared down the street, her silhouette framed by the fading sunlight, leaving the bikers to grumble among themselves. And as she walked away, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, not because she had to fight or prove herself, but because she had remained true to herself, calm and focused, and had shown them that appearances can be deceiving. No one on that street would ever forget the quiet power of that moment, even if they didn't understand it fully. And she, walking back to her dorm, knew that while the day had started like any other, it had quietly reminded her, and anyone watching, that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just steady, calm, and unshakable. The moment she had passed the bikers, it seemed like the tension should have ended, but it hadn't. They weren't used to being ignored, and more importantly, they weren't used to being disrespected. One of them muttered under his breath, frustration evident in his tone, while another shifted nervously from foot to foot. They could sense something was different about her, something they hadn't expected. Their instincts told them she was no ordinary student, yet they didn't fully understand why. "Hey!" one of them called out, louder this time, trying to regain control of the situation. "Where do you think you're going? Come back here for a minute." She stopped in her tracks without turning around. Her body was relaxed, but her senses were on high alert. She could hear their motorcycles idling, smell the faint aroma of leather and gasoline, and feel the slight vibration through the pavement. It wasn't fear. It was focus. Every detail mattered. Every movement mattered. Slowly, she turned her head, looking at them over her shoulder. She didn't rush or seem threatened. Instead, she spoke calmly, almost softly, but with a firmness that made them pause. "I'm going where I need to go. You should consider doing the same." The bikers exchanged glances. Some were annoyed, some confused. They hadn't expected anyone to speak to them that way, let alone remain so calm under their intimidation. One of the louder ones leaned against his bike, smirking, trying to hide the unease creeping into his voice. "You think you can tell us what to do?" he asked. Her gaze didn't waver. Her eyes were steady, calm, and observant. Every subtle movement of theirs, the way they shifted weight, the tension in their arms, the nervous glance at one another, was noticed by her. She had been trained to read people, to assess situations, and to anticipate actions before they happened. Years of discipline had prepared her for moments like this, where quick thinking and calm presence mattered more than strength alone. "Not telling you what to do," she replied evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "Just letting you know I'm not someone to push around." The words were simple, but the way she said them made all the difference. There was no anger, no aggression, only confidence. Confidence that came from knowing she could handle whatever came her way. For a brief moment, the bikers hesitated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. They had expected fear, maybe a sharp reaction, something they could use to assert their dominance. But she had given neither. Her calm, collected demeanor was unsettling to them. It was confusing. They had assumed their usual tactics would work, that intimidation would be enough. But now the dynamic was changing. One of the bikers, trying to regain control, stepped a little closer. He wanted to provoke a reaction, to see if she would flinch, shout, or bolt. He raised his voice and leaned forward, trying to assert dominance. "You think you're tough, huh? Walking around here like that all alone?" She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply tilted her head slightly, analyzing him, analyzing the group. Her mind was a quiet storm of calculations. What they might do next, how fast, and how she could respond if necessary. She knew she didn't need to escalate the situation physically yet. Her presence alone, her composure, was enough to make them second-guess their actions. Still, the bikers weren't willing to back down. One of them laughed, a harsh, forced sound, trying to cover his uncertainty with humor. "What's with the silent treatment? You gonna say something, or just stand there like a statue?" She finally spoke again, her tone still calm, still measured. "I'm done talking, I'm walking." It was the truth. She wasn't interested in confrontation, but she also wasn't willing to be pushed around. And the clarity in her statement, combined with the unshakable confidence in her posture, sent a subtle warning to the group. Any further action would be met with consequences. They didn't fully understand what those consequences might be, but they sensed they didn't want to find out. The loudest biker, frustrated by her composure, decided to try a different tactic. He walked in front of her, blocking her path with a swaggering step, attempting to intimidate her physically. His hands rested on his hips, his chest out, his grin cocky. "You're not going anywhere until we're done here," he said, trying to make it sound like a joke. Her eyes followed, his movements carefully. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight shift in his stance, the way he unconsciously kept his weight balanced. She understood instinctively that he wanted to intimidate, but he wasn't fully prepared for someone who knew how to read him. Without making a sudden move, she stepped slightly to the side, shifting her balance, keeping herself centered. Her body language was subtle, but it spoke volumes. She was aware, she was ready, and she was not afraid. For a moment there was silence. The street seemed to hold its breath. Even the faint hum of the motorcycles seemed quieter. People walking nearby slowed down, sensing something unusual in the air. The bikers, who were used to being the center of attention, were now unsure. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not the quiet, unyielding kind that didn't require shouting or aggression. Trying once more to assert control, the loud biker reached for her backpack. It was a reckless move, one that might have seemed like a harmless joke to him. But she was ready. Her hand shot out instinctively, grabbing the strap and holding it firmly. The movement was quick, precise, controlled. The biker froze, momentarily, shocked by her speed and composure. "You really shouldn't do that," she said calmly. No yelling, no threats. Just a quiet warning that carried far more weight than any raised voice could. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The tension that had been building suddenly seemed heavier. They had expected fear or a reaction they could exploit, but instead they were met with calm, precise control. One of them muttered something under his breath, frustration creeping in, but no one dared act further. She adjusted her backpack and continued walking, each step measured and deliberate. Her pace wasn't hurried, but it was confident. Every movement was intentional. She didn't need to show aggression because her calm strength already spoke for itself. As she moved down the street, the bikers stayed behind, still unsure of what to do next. Some crossed their arms, others leaned against their bikes, all of them trying to act casual but clearly unsettled. They were used to being in control, to having others react to them. But here was someone who defied their expectations, completely. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't let it affect her. She kept walking, focused on her path, aware of everything around her but not consumed by fear or anger. Her mind was clear, her senses alert, and her body ready to respond if necessary. Nearby students watched, some whispering to each other, noticing the unusual tension. They couldn't see the years of training and experience that gave her the calm strength she exuded, but they could see that something about her made the bikers hesitate. They could feel that this wasn't an ordinary encounter. The bikers, realizing that they had misjudged her, started to drift back to their motorcycles. Their bravado had been challenged in a way they weren't used to, and they weren't sure how to regain the upper hand. The loudest one muttered something angrily, but the words didn't carry the same weight as before. They had underestimated her, and now they were left with the uneasy feeling of someone who had refused to be intimidated. She didn't look back. She didn't gloat or celebrate. She simply walked with steady steps, her mind focused, aware that the encounter wasn't over but confident in her ability to handle whatever came next. Her calm had disrupted the usual patterns of intimidation, and that alone was a victory. By the time she reached the corner leading to the main road, the bikers were still standing there, murmuring among themselves. They hadn't expected her composure, her confidence, or the quiet way she had maintained control without aggression. They had assumed she would be an easy target, but she had shown them otherwise. As she continued down the street, disappearing into the fading light, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because she had to fight, but because she had remained true to herself, calm, aware, and ready. She had shown that strength doesn't always roar. It can be quiet, measured, and completely unshakable. And in that quiet strength she carried a message that anyone watching, whether the bikers or nearby students, could understand. Appearances can be deceiving, and true courage isn't always loud. It's steady, calm, and prepared. The tension from the earlier encounter still lingered in the air. Even as she walked away from the bikers, there was a sense that the situation wasn't over. She could feel it, not in fear, but in her instincts. Years of training had taught her that when someone underestimated you, they often tried again. She wasn't about to let that happen. Every step she took was measured, steady, and aware. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't careless either. Her senses were alert to every sound, every movement, every shadow along the quiet street. A few moments later, the rumble of motorcycles returned. The same group had circled around, attempting to catch up to her. Their earlier embarrassment had not stopped them. If anything, it made them more determined to reassert themselves. They were loud, brash, and unaware that the person they were confronting was far from ordinary. One of them called out, trying to sound playful, but the nervousness in his voice betrayed him. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" "We're just having fun." She didn't quicken her pace. Instead, she slowed slightly, making it clear she was aware of them. She didn't yell or respond angrily, She simply turned her head, meeting their eyes with a calm, steady gaze. It was the kind of gaze that made people stop and reconsider their actions, though they didn't know why. There was no anger, no threat, just a quiet confidence that radiated strength. The bikers were confused. They had expected to see someone scared or startled, maybe even someone who would snap back angrily. Instead, they found someone completely unshaken. The silence that followed her gaze felt heavier than any words they could have shouted. For the first time, they realized they might have misjudged her completely. Trying to regain control, one of the bikers stepped closer. He wanted to see if she would flinch or react aggressively. He leaned slightly forward, his arms spread casually, trying to make himself appear larger. "You think walking away is going to solve anything?" he asked, his voice forced and unsure. Her body remained relaxed, but her stance was deliberate. She knew how to position herself to maintain balance and readiness. Her mind analyzed their movements, their body language, and their intentions. She didn't need to shout or push back. Her presence alone was enough to convey that she was not someone to mess with. "You should think about your choices," she said softly, her voice calm but full of authority. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning in the usual sense. It was simply a statement of fact. She was aware, prepared, and capable. That alone unsettled them. The loudest biker, clearly frustrated, tried another tactic. He leaned against a nearby fence, casually swinging his leg, and attempted to make a joke, hoping to mask his uncertainty. "Come on, lighten up. We're just having fun. Don't be so serious all the time." She looked at him, her gaze steady. Her eyes weren't hostile. They were observant, calculating. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the slight quiver in his fingers, the way his eyes kept darting to the others for reassurance. She recognized it immediately. They were trying to act tough, but they were uncertain now. She took a slow step to the side, adjusting her balance without any rush. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to make threats. Every motion she made was controlled, precise, and intentional. The bikers began to realize that she wasn't just calm. She was in complete control of her body and her space. Trying one last time, one of the bikers made a sudden move toward her, perhaps hoping to scare her or provoke a reaction. He reached out, intending to grab her backpack, but she was faster. In a blink, her hand shot out, firmly securing the strap and keeping him from touching her. The motion was smooth, controlled, and effortless, as if it were second nature. "You really don't want to do that?" she said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. But the words carried weight because of the quiet power behind them. The bikers froze. They had expected someone panicked or aggressive, someone who would react emotionally. They didn't expect control. They didn't expect precision. And they definitely didn't expect calm strength that didn't need to be loud to be intimidating. For a few moments there was silence. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to pause. The students walking nearby slowed down, sensing the unusual tension. The bikers, who were used to being in control, suddenly felt uncertain. Their usual tactics weren't working. Their confidence, once high, was now shaken. She adjusted her backpack and continued walking, her pace steady. Each step was deliberate, each movement intentional. She wasn't in a rush, but she wasn't careless. She knew they might follow, but she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. Her training, her experience, and her focus had prepared her for moments exactly like this. The bikers, still trying to act tough, murmured among themselves. They were frustrated, confused, and unsure. They had misjudged her completely, assuming she was just another student who could be intimidated. Instead, they were facing someone who had complete control over the situation without ever raising her voice. The quiet power in her presence began to have an effect. One by one, the bikers started to hesitate, unsure whether to continue their intimidation or retreat. They had expected easy control, but they weren't used to encountering someone who was unshakable and aware, someone who seemed to anticipate their moves without even trying. One of the bikers muttered something angrily under his breath, clearly frustrated by the lack of response he had hoped for. Another leaned against his bike, trying to act casual, but failing. They had underestimated her, and now they were left with the uneasy feeling of someone who refused to be intimidated. She didn't look back, didn't gloat, didn't show any emotion other than calm awareness. She simply walked with steady steps, maintaining her composure. Her presence alone was a challenge, a quiet demonstration of strength. The bikers, realizing they couldn't bully her without consequence, began to step back, their bravado fading. It was clear that they were no longer confident. The loudest one muttered a half-hearted joke, but it didn't carry the same weight as before. The group's dynamic had shifted entirely. What they had thought would be an easy moment of dominance had turned into a lesson in caution. The student kept walking, aware that the situation wasn't entirely over. She had handled the immediate threat, but she knew the bikers might still try something foolish. Still, she felt a quiet satisfaction. She hadn't needed to yell, fight, or retaliate. Her calm, steady confidence had done all the work. The moment left an impression on the students nearby. They couldn't see the years of experience and training behind her composure, but they could sense that something remarkable had happened. She had faced a threat, maintained her calm, and asserted control without aggression. It was a rare display of strength, one that didn't rely on violence but on awareness, discipline, and self-assurance. By the time she reached the corner leading to the main road, the bikers were still lingering behind. They hadn't gone far, but their confidence was gone. They had underestimated her, and the lesson had been humbling. Their attempts at intimidation had failed, and they now faced the uneasy realization that appearances could be deceiving. She continued walking, her steps measured, her mind clear, her senses sharp. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt confident. She had faced a challenge, maintained control, and walked away without losing her composure. The encounter had tested her patience, her awareness, and her ability to remain calm under pressure. And in that quiet, controlled strength, she carried a message. Courage doesn't always need to be loud or aggressive. Sometimes the greatest power is in calm, steady presence and confidence and awareness that make others rethink their actions. For the bikers, the encounter was a shock, a reminder that assumptions could be dangerous. For anyone watching, it was an unexpected lesson in courage, awareness, and self-control. And for her, it was another quiet affirmation that preparation, focus, and calm strength were more powerful than any act of intimidation could ever be. The street was quieter now, the distant hum of traffic and the faint sound of evening birds the only noises breaking the calm. But she knew the bikers hadn't given up yet. There was something about the way they lingered in the distance, the way their motorcycles remained parked strategically, that told her they were thinking about their next move. She could feel it, not fear, but awareness. Every step she took, every small movement, was deliberate. She was no stranger to tense situations, and she trusted her instincts completely. She slowed her pace slightly as she approached a corner, a place where the street opened into a wider road. The wider space meant fewer hiding spots for potential surprises, and she liked it. Her eyes scanned the area carefully, taking in the parked cars, the dim streetlights, and the subtle shadows along the edges. She was fully aware of the environment, not out of paranoia, but out of preparation. Preparation was her strength, and awareness was her weapon. The bikers began to emerge from the side street, moving more deliberately this time. Their previous attempts at intimidation hadn't worked, and now they were trying a different approach. They rode their motorcycles slowly, circling her, hoping to create pressure and make her feel trapped. But she wasn't trapped. She had practiced staying calm under pressure, and she had learned to read movements and intentions in ways that most people couldn't. One of them revved his bike slightly, the engine growling as if to assert dominance. The sound was loud and meant to be intimidating, but she didn't flinch. Her stance remained steady, her eyes observing every small detail. She noticed the hesitation in their movements, the subtle signs that they weren't as confident as they appeared. This wasn't a group that had encountered someone like her before. "Why are you walking like that?" One of them shouted over the engine noise, trying to act casual but failing. "You think you're some kind of tough girl?" She didn't respond immediately. She simply shifted her weight slightly, keeping her balance centered and stable. Her movements were calm, precise, and deliberate. She was giving them all the information they needed without saying a word. She was aware, she was ready, and she wasn't afraid. The bikers hesitated, clearly unsettled by her calmness. They had expected fear, panic, or at least some sign of nervousness. Instead, they found composure and confidence. Every instinct they had for intimidation was being challenged by her presence alone. Trying to regain control, one of them circled closer, leaning forward slightly on his bike to make himself appear larger. "Come on, don't be so serious," he said, attempting to laugh it off. "We're just having fun." She looked at him steadily, her eyes unwavering. There was no anger, no hostility, just a quiet strength that was almost palpable. Her gaze seemed to measure him, to read him in a way that made him uncomfortable. He shifted slightly under her scrutiny, realizing that his usual tactics weren't working. Without breaking her calm, she stepped slightly forward, positioning herself in a way that showed she wasn't intimidated. Her posture was relaxed, yet alert. She didn't need to threaten or shout. Her presence alone spoke volumes. It was the kind of quiet power that makes people stop and reconsider their actions. The bikers, realizing that their usual methods had failed, began to circle her, more cautiously. Their confidence was slipping. They had underestimated her, and now their attempts to assert dominance were faltering. Each of them was trying to act tough, but the uncertainty was clear in their movements. One of them made a sudden move toward her, perhaps hoping to provoke a reaction or scare her. He reached out, aiming for her backpack, but she was ready. Her hand moved instinctively, grasping the strap firmly and preventing him from making contact. The motion was quick, controlled, and precise, a clear demonstration that she wasn't someone to mess with. "You really don't want to do that," she said calmly. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, but the weight behind it was undeniable. There was no aggression, no threat, only quiet authority. The words alone were enough to make them pause. For a moment, the street seemed suspended in time. The hum of engines, the distant traffic, and even the evening breeze felt secondary to the tension that had built between them. The bikers, who were used to controlling situations, were now unsure. Their confidence had been challenged, and they didn't know how to regain it. She adjusted her backpack and continued walking, her movement steady and deliberate. Each step was a demonstration of awareness and control. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't panicking. She was calm, focused, and ready for whatever might come next. The bikers muttered among themselves, frustration creeping into their voices. Their attempts to intimidate her had failed. They had expected to see fear or resistance, but instead they found calm, control, and an unshakable presence. They were learning, slowly, that appearances can be deceiving. One of the bikers tried a different tactic, revving his engine louder and circling her in a wider arc. He wanted to pressure her, to make her feel cornered. But she wasn't cornered. She had trained for situations where every movement mattered, where awareness and preparation could prevent harm. She adjusted her stance slightly, maintaining balance and stability. Her body language sent a clear message. She was ready, she was aware, and she wouldn't be intimidated. The others began to hesitate, their bravado fading as they realized that their intimidation tactics were failing. The group's dynamic was shifting. They were no longer confident, they were uncertain. They had underestimated her, and the realization was unsettling. She didn't look back or react with anger. She continued walking, her eyes scanning the street, aware of every movement and sound. Her calmness was contagious. Even the students watching from a distance felt the shift in energy. They could see that this wasn't an ordinary encounter. As she approached a more open section of the street, she slowed slightly, giving the bikers space to retreat if they wanted. Her movements were deliberate, showing that she wasn't seeking confrontation, but she also wasn't backing down. She was in control of herself and the situation. The bikers, realizing that they couldn't bully her without consequences, began to step back. Their earlier confidence had been shattered, replaced by uncertainty. They had underestimated her, and now they were left to reconsider their actions. She continued walking, her pace steady and calm. Each step was a reminder of her awareness and preparation. She had faced a threat, maintained control, and demonstrated quiet strength. She didn't need to fight to prove herself. Her presence alone had done that. The moment left an impression on everyone nearby. Students, passers-by, and even the bikers themselves had witnessed something unusual. It was a demonstration of courage, awareness, and self-control. She had faced potential danger and responded with calm confidence, proving that strength doesn't always need to be loud or aggressive. By the time she reached the next street corner, the bikers had stopped following. They lingered briefly, glancing at her as she disappeared into the distance, but they were no longer sure what to do. Their attempts at intimidation had failed, and they had learned a valuable lesson. Appearances can be deceiving, and underestimating someone can have consequences. She walked on, her mind clear, her senses alert, and her body relaxed. The encounter had tested her awareness, patience, and composure, and she had passed with quiet strength. She didn't feel victorious, but she felt confident. She had maintained control, avoided confrontation, and shown that calm awareness could be more powerful than aggression. And as she continued down the street, disappearing into the evening shadows, she carried with her the knowledge that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and unshakable. It's in the awareness, preparation, and calm confidence that leave others unsure of how to proceed. The bikers left behind were reminded of the lesson in a way they wouldn't forget. And for anyone watching, it was a subtle but powerful message. Strength isn't always physical, and courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet presence of someone who knows they can handle whatever comes their way. The evening air was calm, with a gentle breeze flowing across the quiet streets. The sun had dipped fully below the horizon now, leaving the sky painted in shades of deep blue and soft orange. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of light on the pavement. She continued walking steadily, her steps measured and deliberate, fully aware that the bikers might still be lingering somewhere nearby. Her mind was calm, her senses alert, her body relaxed but ready. Even though the immediate threat seemed to have passed, she knew better than to let her guard down completely. People who had underestimated her once might try again, or at least talk about the encounter in ways that could stir trouble later. But she walked with quiet confidence, knowing that she had already handled everything that mattered. The bikers had misjudged her from the start, and by now they were learning that appearances can be deceiving. As she moved further down the street toward the more populated areas near the campus, she noticed the bikers slowly retreating to a corner, their motorcycles idling softly. They weren't chasing her anymore, but she could see that they were still watching. Their earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and caution. They had realized, perhaps too late, that she wasn't just another student. She carried herself with a calm strength that told them she was capable of defending herself if necessary. Her mind wandered briefly to the reactions of the nearby students. Some had watched from doorways and bus stops, whispering quietly to one another. Others had paused mid-step on their way home. The way she had handled herself left an impression. They might not have understood the full extent of her experience, but they could see something remarkable. Courage and awareness could hold more power than loud words or physical posturing. She had walked alone, faced potential danger, and yet remained composed and in control the entire time. The bikers, meanwhile, had stopped attempting any direct intimidation. They shifted from foot to foot, glancing at one another and at her, trying to read what had just happened. They muttered complaints and attempted half-hearted jokes, but the confidence they had carried when they first noticed her was gone. She had demonstrated, without violence or shouting, that she wasn't someone to provoke or underestimate. Even the slightest action against her now would be risky, and they knew it. She slowed her pace slightly as she reached a small park along the campus perimeter. The open space gave her a clear view of her surroundings, and she liked that. Open areas allowed her to move freely and assess potential threats without obstruction. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, and let herself feel a small sense of satisfaction. Not pride or arrogance, just recognition that she had maintained her composure, stayed aware, and prevented any escalation from occurring. That was victory in itself. As she continued walking through the park, she noticed students sitting on benches, talking quietly, or walking in pairs. She caught glimpses of their curious looks. Some had clearly witnessed portions of the confrontation from a distance, and she could sense their respect and admiration. She didn't look to impress anyone, but the awareness that her actions could have inspired or reassured others was quietly rewarding. Sometimes courage isn't just about confronting danger. It's about showing people that calm, deliberate strength exists even in ordinary moments. The bikers had finally started moving away, leaving the immediate area. They didn't seem angry anymore. Rather, they seemed unsettled, reflecting on the encounter. One of them muttered, almost to himself, "That wasn't what I expected." Another gave a half-hearted laugh, though it lacked conviction. Their confidence was broken, and they now understood something that they had ignored at the start. Not everyone is as they appear. Sometimes someone who seems ordinary carries experiences, discipline, and skill that can't be judged at first glance. She walked on, her mind still alert, but a sense of calm washed over her. She had navigated the situation with awareness and composure, never letting fear or aggression dictate her actions. She had faced potential danger and handled it not with anger or force, but with calculated, deliberate calm. That was something she had learned over years of training and experience. Sometimes the most powerful way to assert control is to stay calm and observant, allowing others' assumptions to work against them. As she approached the main road that led to her dorm, she noticed a few students walking in groups, their chatter punctuated with occasional laughter. She kept her pace steady, maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Even here, in a relatively open and populated space, she remained alert. Her instincts were not driven by fear, but by caution and readiness. She understood that control over a situation came from clarity of mind, awareness, and calm presence. By the time she reached the entrance to the dorm, the street behind her was mostly quiet. The bikers had left, fading into the distance, and the campus was settling into the calm rhythm of early evening. She paused briefly at the entrance, taking another deep breath. She felt a sense of quiet triumph, not because she had fought or shouted, but because she had maintained control, defended herself without aggression, and walked away with dignity. The encounter had been a test, not just of her physical readiness, but of her mental clarity and ability to remain calm under pressure. She had passed it. The bikers had misjudged her from the start, but she had handled the situation in a way that left them uncertain, humbled, and cautious. She had demonstrated, without needing to raise her voice or use force, that courage and awareness are powerful tools. She walked into her dorm, closing the door behind her, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The evening had reminded her of something important. Strength isn't always loud, and courage doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful way to respond to a threat is with calm awareness, careful observation, and quiet confidence. She had shown that to the bikers, to the students who had watched from a distance, and most importantly, to herself. Later, as she settled into her room and reflected on the events of the evening, she understood that the encounter would likely be remembered by others on campus for days. It wasn't about fear or intimidation. It was about the quiet demonstration of strength and awareness. People often underestimate others based on appearances, but she had proven that experience, discipline, and calm composure are forces that can't be ignored. Her mind replayed small details, the subtle hesitation in the bikers' movements, the way they faltered when she maintained her composure, the momentary pause when she prevented them from touching her backpack. Every detail was a reminder that control comes from presence and awareness, not from aggression or shouting. The entire encounter had been a lesson in how to handle difficult situations with calm confidence, and she had done it flawlessly. As the night settled in, she allowed herself to relax fully. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had faced a situation that could have turned tense or dangerous, yet she had navigated it with awareness, discipline, and calm strength. That was victory, the kind that doesn't need applause or recognition but that resonates deeply within. The bikers, on the other hand, had learned something valuable, even if they didn't admit it aloud. They had underestimated someone who walked alone, who appeared ordinary, but was anything but. They had been forced to confront their assumptions and acknowledge, in their own way, that courage and strength aren't always visible at first glance. The students who had watched from a distance might not have understood every nuance, but they had witnessed a rare moment of composed courage. They had seen someone face potential intimidation with calm awareness, and they had seen that strength doesn't have to be loud to be effective. It left a lasting impression, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that courage comes in many forms. She lay in bed that night reflecting on the day. She thought about the bikers, about the students, and about herself. The experience had reaffirmed something she already knew. True strength lies in preparation, awareness, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. She hadn't needed to fight. She hadn't needed to shout. She had simply been aware, composed, and ready, and that had been enough. And as sleep finally came, she felt at peace. The confrontation was over. The bikers had left. The students were safe. She had maintained her dignity, her calm, and her control. It was a quiet triumph, the kind that doesn't make headlines but resonates deeply with those who understand what true courage really means. Sometimes, she thought, the strongest victories are the ones where no one gets hurt, no one shouts, and yet the lesson is clear. Courage, awareness, and calm confidence speak louder than any aggression ever could. And tonight, that message had been delivered perfectly.